All right. What's going on, everyone? Happy holidays. Hope everyone has had a great holiday season so far, and welcome to this month's KeyShot 9 RealCloth webinar. My name is Kareem Merchant. I'm one of the new creative specialists here at Luxion, based out of our Orange County, California headquarters. I hope you guys have had the opportunity to explore all the new and exciting features KeyShot 9 has to offer. And for those who have not, hopefully this webinar will serve as a springboard into future explorations. If you have not already done so, you can download a free trial copy of KeyShot at keyshot.com/try. In this webinar, I'll be covering the new patent-pending RealCloth feature available to KeyShot 9 users. RealCloth is certainly a feature that has had me excited since learning about it. As a designer, I've personally struggled to create realistic woven materials in the past, so having a feature like the new RealCloth is an incredible game changer in that respect. As always, a recording of this webinar will be available at youtube.com/keyshot3d, where we'll also post a link to a download link to this presentation. The comment section on YouTube is a great place to engage in the KeyShot 9 conversation, and it's also a great place to let us know your thoughts on new features, as well as post comments and suggestions relating to future learning content. All right, a little bit about the rig I'm currently using for this webinar. I'm presenting from an HP Z8 with dual Intel Xeon Gold 6154 processors at 3 gigahertz with 96 gigs of RAM, running Windows 10 Pro and powered by a Quadro RTX 4000 GPU. I pre-recorded a little demo that I'll be playing a little later. That demo was recorded on an HP Z4 Intel Core i9 7920X at 2.9 gigahertz with 64 gigs of RAM, running Windows 10 Pro and powered by an RTX 2080 GPU. I'd also like to mention here, we have a few of the Luxion team members standing by to answer any questions you may have regarding the new feature, so please don't be shy, feel free to ask away. All right, to give you a little overview of what we'll be covering today, we'll continue the webinar with a tech overview by one of our software engineers here in a moment, and then look at how RealCloth can augment existing workflows, as well as best practices for RealCloth usage. I'll play a short demo running through some of the features, and we'll finish with some Q&A with the Luxion team and myself. This is going to be a slightly shorter webinar than usual, but it should be packed full of helpful RealCloth information. With that said, let me introduce you to Soren Gommelmark, one of our software engineers here at Luxion. Soren, why don't you jump on in and speak a bit about the technical aspects of the new RealCloth feature?
Yes, thank you, Kareem. As Kareem said, my name is Søren Gammelmark. I was the primary developer on RealCloth. And here at Luxion, we have been looking at cloth, and in particular woven cloth, for a while. And in order to model a material in a renderer like KeyShot, the first question we ask is, what are the key visual characteristics that differentiate this new material from the other materials? For cloth, there are two aspects of the visual appearance that we want to be sure we could reproduce with a new material. The first is the highlights, and you can see in these images that the highlights are very different, and I will come back to that in a moment. Highlights and textiles are very much more complex than other materials, and cloth has very anisotropic highlights, and that means they appear very different when viewed or illuminated at different angles. In addition, sometimes cloth can have more than one highlight, where most materials only have one. Also, many textiles appear quite soft, and it can be hard to quantify exactly what this actually means, but in many cases it can be attributed to what is known as sheen, or a highlight at grazing angles. This is particularly visible on velvet, if you've been looking at that, but many other textiles also show sheen to some degree. Both of these elements can be very hard to reproduce using other materials in KeyShot or in other renderers, which is why we decided to add a dedicated material for this purpose. But let's first have a look at the structure of cloth and what this tells us about the visual properties. Next slide, please. So here you see some pictures of cloth under a microscope. There are three types of cloth here. There's both where you can see the entire pattern, and there's a close-up of one of the yarns comprising the pattern. So there are two plain weaves. This is the first and the second, the blue and the green one, and then there's a satin weave. There's some very important takeaways from these images that you can more or less see directly from the images. The yarns that make up the textiles have very different levels of glossiness. For example, the blue yarn is way less way less glossy than the green yarns, for example, in the silk, which is both of them are plain weave, but they have very different levels of glossiness. Also, some of the yarns are much more compressed than others. This is clear in B, where the yarns going from the left to the right are much more flat than the yarns going from the top to bottom. And even when you view a textile close up and straight down from the top, as here, you can see also that the yarns will shadow each other a lot depending on where the light is coming from. This is also quite important for the visual aspects. And finally, as I was alluding to before, the position of the highlights, and you can almost see this from these images directly, that depends a lot on the shape of the yarns and how they enter the weaving pattern. In particular, I have looked a bit closer at the silk, as you can see in one of the graphs below. If you light silk at normal incidence, like straight down and hit it just on the top, you will actually see two highlights at what we call off-specular peaks. So these highlights are not located where a highlight would normally appear on a rough surface, but is tilted with respect to the normal. And this is called specular splitting, because you have two highlights, and also it's off-specular because it's not located the usual place. And this is not something you normally find on other types of materials, but for cloth, and in particularly shiny textiles such as silk and satins, it's actually quite common. And if you look closely the next time you see a piece of cloth, you'll probably be able to notice this. And this is something we can reproduce in KeyShot. So we can take the next slide. So here are two renderings from KeyShot where the properties on RealCloth is exactly the same except the weaving pattern. And you will notice the image on the left has actually this split highlight. You can see it particularly if you look near to the bump at the center of the image. There are actually two highlight peaks, whereas if you look on the image to the right, there's only a single very broad highlight. And this is simply due to the weaving pattern and the way it's set up. And if you scrutinize the details of the setup in KeyShot, you can see that there is a round vertical yarn that's round and very straight, and then there is a loosely woven flat yarn going over the straight yarns. And this actually gives rise to this split highlights and these long soft highlights that you get from satin. I suggest you try this in KeyShot and see which different looks you can get, because it can make a surprising amount of difference depending on how you set up the weaving pattern. So it's not just the texture, there's lots of detail to play with there. And the next topic I mentioned in the beginning was the softness of the sheen. So if we can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, velvet is a very extreme example of sheen. Only the highlights at grazing angle is actually present on velvet, and this gives a very peculiar appearance if you look at it. The reason that velvet looks like this is that velvet is in reality a forest of many small fibers sticking out of the surface. And all these small fibers sticking out of the surface, they are much harder to see if you look straight down them than if you look at them at grazing angle. You can actually see this on the KeyShot material ball to the right, where you can almost not see any of the fibers sticking out of the surface. You can see the effect of the shadow, of course, but you cannot see the individual fibers. But you can more easily see them when you look at them at grazing angle. And this is very much what causes the sheen. It is these small fibers sticking out of the surface. In fact, you've probably noticed, or maybe you have noticed this if you look at a field of grass with flowers in them, because if you would be looking at the field of grass at a grazing angle, like close to the grass and looking down the field, you would be able to see lots of flowers. But if you stand up or stand up high and look down, they're actually much harder to see. And this is very much the same effect. When you look at these fibers sticking out of the surface, they are much more visible if you look at them at grazing angle. And since the fibers sticking out of the surface can kind of catch light and even bend it around corners, this is going to give you this sheen effect, which is a highlight at grazing angle. Almost all textiles has this effect to a larger or lesser extent, where velvet is a very extreme example. And in RealCloth, we decided to actually add these small fibers because it does provide a lot of interesting visual detail. We could have modeled it as kind of an in-surface property, but then you wouldn't be able to make these very fluffy fabrics where it's very clear that these small fibers play a part. But you also get this even very tactile visual complexity that's often the make or breaker of a very good image, even if you cannot really see the small fibers. And the next slide, which is just a quick summary, is that it's important to keep in mind when you play with RealCloth that the yarn properties and the shape of the yarn is extremely important for the appearance when you look at it from far away. So don't shy away from playing with the weave pattern editor and trying different levels of tension and size and types of yarn when you play with RealCloth. And finally, also the sheen or the flyaway fibers are very important to get this feel of the softness that you get from many fabrics. There's a lot to say about woven cloth and cloth in general, but for now, I hope you picked up a few details about why RealCloth is like it is, and maybe get some hints on how to look at cloth and how to reproduce that in KeyShot. That's it from me.
Awesome. Thanks, Soren. Appreciate the technical overview. Hopefully that's helped all of you get a better understanding of how RealCloth is unique to the industry and why it works the way it does. So let's jump right into this incredible new KeyShot feature and start exploring some ways that RealCloth can enhance your workflow, as well as a few best practices that should help speed up your RealCloth experience. To begin with, I'd like to discuss some examples of how RealCloth can play a role augmenting your existing workflow. Previously, procedural textures have served as the best way to create realistic cloth materials. Here you can see some examples of renderings made using procedural textures, which do a great job mimicking how cloth appears to the naked eye. Notice that many of these are very convincing and do a spectacular job of evoking the appearance of a woven material. However, for closer distances, the material may become less convincing depending on the type of material you're representing. Materials such as felts, wools, chenille, and cottons typically have errant strands or fuzzy surfaces that can't be accurately replicated using procedurals. Subsequently, creating accurate textiles using procedurals is also a significantly more involved process than using the newly implemented RealCloth feature, which you can see from the example on the screen, procedurals on the left and RealCloth on the right. Although RealCloth does make creating highly realistic woven materials incredibly easy, procedurals can still play a role in creating lower impact files when building out scenes. Typically, RealCloth will require much more computing power than using procedurals due to the complexity of the created geometry. As Soren touched on, RealCloth replicates the geometry of warp and weft fibers accurately rather than using a surface bump, so the spaces between strands are actually empty rather than just surface depressions that give the illusion of negative space. This is something worth considering when creating scenes that have large amounts of fabric surfaces. For instance, if you're building out an interior scene with multiple fabric upholstered furniture pieces and a carpet floor rug, your file with RealCloth material applied to everything would be incredibly heavy. If the goal is to shoot close-ups or three-quarter shots of certain elements within the space, then a good way of approaching the scene would be to use procedurals on background and peripheral elements while using RealCloth on the specific objects that the camera's focused on. If we look at this example, you can see an upholstered chair with RealCloth applied to both the front and back of the chair surfaces, as well as a few of the background elements. Despite having minimal RealCloth and furniture elements, the number of polygons is still fairly high. If you were to apply the same textures to a complete interior scene of this size, you would easily climb to over 2 or 3 million polygons. Definitely keep that in mind, as not all computer configurations will be able to handle very high polygon counts effectively or efficiently. And on that note, let's go ahead and jump into our demo using this same scene as our example so that you can get a solid overview of how the new feature can be implemented. Now that we've had a chance to look at how RealCloth compares to existing options, let's open up KeyShot 9 and dive deeper into how to implement RealCloth into your workflow. I'm currently working with the scene of an armchair that I've previously staged and adjusted. To get started, I'm going to assign a material option from the RealCloth folder in the Materials library by dragging and dropping it onto a surface that I'd like to apply it to.
It's important to note here that to achieve the highest level of success when mapping RealCloth, you should ensure that your model has been UV unwrapped prior to mapping your material, or you may experience unexpected seam lines and/or patchiness. You'll notice that with the new material, the weave scale has changed. In this example, the scale is still believable at its current size, but in some instances, this might not be the case. To make adjustments and customize your newly applied RealCloth material, there are two options. We can either work from the Properties subtab in the Project window, or we can work from the Material graph. In either location, you'll be able to easily and intuitively customize the appearance of your assigned RealCloth material. For this model, I'm going to start by adjusting my weave scale to better replicate the type of textile I'd like to mimic. I can do that by entering the mapping accordion in the Properties subtab. Here I can decide what mode I'm going to use to map my material, as well as the scale at which my material will be mapped. Notice under Scale Modes that I have two options. If I hover over each, a tooltip will pop up to describe the purpose of each option. The Units option uses the scene units as reference when mapping scale, while UV relates the scale mapping to the units assigned in your modeling software. If you experience discrepancies or any issues with mapping when using the UV option, stick with the Units option instead. In my workflow, I typically stick with the Units option from the get-go for simplicity's sake. I can then make my desired adjustments within the Properties subtab and execute geometry nodes. If your pattern is using the flyaway fiber function, be sure to execute your geometry nodes or your pattern geometry will not be correctly updated. Now that my weave is set up, I'd like to further adjust my threads by opening the warp and weft accordions. You'll notice several adjustment options from refractivity to roughness. All users of KeyShot have access to adjustments through here or the material graph. These locations are also where you would adjust each respective thread color. For those unfamiliar with warp and weft, warp pertains to vertical threading, while weft relates to horizontal threading. I'm going to quickly change my thread colors to something that matches my vision a little bit better. Then I'm going to execute my geometry nodes to make sure that the material is updated correctly. A little tip here, if your thread color is not appearing as deep as you would like, try changing the specular to a color closer to the assigned thread color. Be careful about going too dark or the realism of the material will be affected. If you're a user of KeyShot Pro, you can further make adjustments using the Edit Weave Pattern function. If I open up the window, you'll notice there are a few more options available for editing the weave pattern. I can select from two types of thread options for each thread direction, as well as customize thread widths. Two awesome features in this window are the ability to select from different pattern presets from the drop-down at the top right of the window, as well as the ability to control how threads overlap by interacting with the weave graphic in the center of the window. With these, you can really tailor how the weave appears for your specific applications. Again, after making your adjustments, be sure to execute your geometry nodes to ensure your material updates accurately to your adjustments. So I'm really liking the way this armchair is coming together. I already have the back material set the way I'd like it, and the material I've been editing is close to my desired appearance, but has a little too much fuzz. My goal is to have the back of the chair look somewhat like a heathered wool material, with the seat and chair back surfaces appearing tighter and a little less fuzz. I can easily adjust these under the geometry accordion. I'm just going to go ahead and adjust some of the different parameters here to values that I feel will better represent the material I'm after. In this case, I'll adjust my density, length, and length variation, and then I'll execute geometry nodes. Now you can see that my material feels tighter and better represents my end goal. At this point, I can let my image res up to get a preview of what my final render will look like. I can also render out a region of my image to get a more accurate depiction of the end product. This would also be a great time to look out for any strange patterning effects occurring in your material. Sometimes, due to focal distance and type of weave pattern, you may experience what appears to be a grid or mesh interference pattern that doesn't belong in your image. These are called moire patterns. To combat these from being present, you can simply increase anti-aliasing, and that should solve your problem. Once you've decided that everything in your scene is copacetic, you can render out your RealCloth image and see your realistic woven material at work.
All right, thanks everyone for sticking with me through the webinar. I hope as a whole it has served to increase your RealCloth knowledge base and gives you guys a solid ground to continue exploring this amazing feature. At this point, let's go ahead and open it up for Q&A with myself and the Luxion team. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kareem. That was a really great overview of the RealCloth feature. We are getting a lot of good feedback in the questions panel. I think maybe one of the first things we should touch on is UVs. You mentioned that good UVs are required to use the RealCloth feature, and we have some people asking about how they can UV unwrap their files from SolidWorks or Pro-E. Would you like to touch on that a little bit?
Sure. As of now, SolidWorks, you can't really unwrap. You'd have to import into another program and unwrap from there. I do believe 9.1 we will have an unwrap function, so do keep your eyes out for that because that will be spectacular and will help with your RealCloth projects that you're rendering.
That's correct. Yeah, we're working on an unwrap UV feature right inside of KeyShot, and it should be coming in a version pretty soon. So you'll be able to do that inside of KeyShot. But for now, if you need to improve the UVs on your model, you can take those files into another software that has UV unwrapping tools, such as Maya or Blender or Rhino, depending on what would fit best with your workflow and what tools you have available. So hopefully that answers that question. Another one that came up early on was from Leo, and he was asking how to make RealCloth appear white. Do you have any tips on that, Kareem?
Yes, if you go into your material graph or actually go into the properties sub-tab, you can jump into the warp and weft colors. Here you can actually control the color of the thread itself, and you can also control the specularity of that thread. If you're noticing some off colors due to light, you can come in here with the specularity, change that to something that's a little bit lighter. And if both of those for warp and weft are selected to the white spectrum, you'll get a very pure white look to your cloth. Hopefully that answers that question.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that gets you pretty close, but I have also experienced that just changing the warp, the color and the specular doesn't always necessarily get a stark white. And what I found is that then adjusting the refractive index to a lower value allows you to achieve a brighter, more stark white. So Leo, hopefully that helps and you're able to achieve something that you're looking for.
Great. All right, we got any more questions?
Martin is asking about opacity and transparency of the RealCloth material. So we do have a setting in the geometry accordion there for transparent. Maybe you can briefly touch on that.
Yeah, so if you see here, there's a tooltip that popped up. The transparency will help create that negative space or bring out that negative space between the threads. So if you're looking for something that is going to pass more light through, I would definitely experiment with the transparency function because that should help increase that amount. Actually, another way that you can also, if you are a user of KeyShot 9 Pro, within the edit weave pattern function, you will actually be able to change the width between the threads themselves, and that should also increase the amount of visibility that you can see through the material.
Yeah, that's a great tip.
One question in there from Rudolph Belterra is integrating with Browseware and Clo3D. We do have a V-Stitcher plugin that came out with KeyShot 9. I'll put that in the link for the plugins into the chat. And so yeah, that's the way to get your Browseware files into KeyShot and then apply RealCloth inside of that. There is no current straight implementation with Clo3D at this time.
Yeah, and the beauty of the way at least Browseware handles the geometry is that it's essentially creating it from a flat pattern, so you don't even have to do any outside UV unwrapping. Those models are just ready to go, and it's just a matter of dragging and dropping from the library or creating those materials from scratch, and you get really incredible results from those Browseware files or V-Stitcher files. Curtis is asking how RealCloth works with animation, and I know you guys have been working on some animations with RealCloth. Can you briefly touch on that?
Yeah, RealCloth, it definitely works well. It is an intensive file dealing with animations because of the amount of geometry that exists, but it is doable, and if you have a computer that is running specs that are powerful enough, you should have zero problems dealing with it. If anyone else would like to expound on that, that would be great too.
I think that's good coverage. One question from Didier was, can we tune the length of the hairs and stuff? Yeah, you want to show them real quick how the flyaways can work?
Yeah, so down in the geometry accordion, if you have flyaway fibers enabled, you can actually tune the length of each fiber, the radius of the fibers, and change the variation so that there's, some non-uniformity to them and they feel more realistic. Everything associated with density, thickness, and length would be controlled in the geometry accordion.
There are a number of questions on knit textiles. Yeah, I mean, the view of RealCloth obviously is that this was a much more straightforward implementation from a UI perspective of how to do this. The knits present a number of issues from a kind of end user management standpoint. It's certainly something that we've looked into, but it's not on the development path at this time. Someone's asking, how do you prep from ZBrush? And if you want to take that one, Kareem.
Ooh, is there somebody that has some experience with ZBrush? I personally do not, so I don't want to speak towards it.
They're saying you get errors when you bring. Yeah, so there were on the initial version between the new version of KeyShot and the new version of ZBrush. There were a couple of issues with regard to the plugin. Eric Rosner asking this question. So you might always make sure that you have the latest versions of everything, of KeyShot, the plugin, and ZBrush. If you're still getting issues, feel free to either post those on the forum. And just so everyone knows, anytime you have a question, you can post them on the general support question on the forum. Our support team's always on there trying to get those questions answered within 24 hours. Or, of course, you can contact support directly as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Derek.
Christoph is asking about the flyaway fiber direction, and there are a couple other questions about further control of the flyaway fibers. Maybe you can open up the material graph and show how you can plug in a texture node to the RealCloth and show what other options are available there.
Yeah, if you look here in the textures, you have several other procedurals as well as different fractals, noise. You have geometry that you could plug in as well, displacement textures, and you would just be able to plug in whatever textures, imagery, bump surfaces that you'd like to any of these nodes here. In doing so, you can affect how the different flyaways and the fibers in the surface will look. But directly altering flyaway fibers is typically straight from the geometry accordion with the RealCloth itself.
If you were to put a traditional image texture map in there, so maybe you can drag that in from the library, from the textures tab.
Sure.
Yeah, anything really. And then drag that input onto the little plus sign at the bottom. And then you should get a menu, and you can see there you can actually control the flyaway density texture with a texture map. And if you're looking for further control, then you would actually use the fuzz geometry node, which allows you to control direction. So you would not use the flyaway fibers on the RealCloth. Instead, you would plug that fuzz node into the parent material node there, geometry, and then you can have further control of the direction and the other options you see there on that fuzz node.
Awesome. Thanks, Rex.
Mm-hmm.
As you can see here in the corner, after altering that, the geometry is asking to be executed again, and always execute your geometry nodes, because as you change patterns, as you change warp and weft, your flyaways will need to be updated.
Troy is asking about labels on top of cloth material. So maybe you can show just adding a label and what characteristics of the RealCloth translate through that label. So why don't you drop a label on there so the attendees can see what we're talking about.
Alrighty.
Yeah, just you can do that from the material tab to keep it simple. So I would close out of the graph there and go to the labels folder in the textures library, and just drop one of those guys on.
All right. And here we go. We can move it around and put it on whatever location we'd like to.
Yeah, and maybe you can zoom in a little bit to show then, you know, what the label looks like on top of RealCloth. I think your camera's locked.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. Take a peek.
So yeah, you can see that the actual weave does not transfer through, but the flyaway fibers do.
Almost looks like it's superimposed on top of it as a different material itself.
Yeah, that's right. And you can define the material of the label, you know, just like a label on any other material. You have control of that in the labels tab there. Christoph is asking if it's possible to put the label on transparent to see the fabric. In order to do that, you would need to apply an opacity map to the label, perhaps, to be able to see some of the weave pattern underneath.
There you go. There's a little bit peeking through.
Rudolph is asking about the stitches in the model itself, in the chair. So I think those are separate surfaces that were modeled
Yes,
for the different patches, and then it looks like the stitches are also modeled as well. Is that correct?
that is correct. Yeah, there's two separate surfaces creating the front and back of the model, and the stitches themselves are actually modeled as well.
All right, well, I think that's it for today. You want to go ahead and wrap it up?
Awesome. Again, thank you all for sticking with me, and don't forget to stay tuned for upcoming tutorials and other learning content from myself and the Luxion team. Thank you, everyone.